Hey everyone, welcome to Food Talk Live. Today I get to chat with somebody I've known for a long time and who I really, really admire. Barton Seaver is a leading expert in sustainable seafood with experience as a chef, author, speaker, educator, advocate. There's a whole long list of things that he does. He's one of the most interesting people I know. He went from
Wow.
being a chef in Washington, D.C., to being a National Geographic explorer, traveling all over the world. He's now he was the director of the Sustainable Seafood and Health Initiative at the Harvard School of Public Health. He's led initiatives to inform consumers and institutions about how our choices for diets and menus can promote healthier people, resilient ecosystems, and more secure food supplies, as well as thriving communities. He's also served as the senior advisor in sustainable seafood innovations at the University of New England and as a sustainability fellow at the New England Aquarium. And now he is the founder of Coastal Culinary Academy, which is a platform that really seeks to increase consumption of and awareness about seafood. And he also has this very cool seafood literacy course, and we can give the website out to that later. Barton, it's really nice to see you. It's been a while now. I feel like the last time I saw you was in Boston a few years ago.
Yeah, it's nice to reconnect, and thank you for such a kind and generous introduction. I really like interacting with humans, especially ones that I admire and love so much as yourself. So, yeah,
I know.
this is fun talking, with
Awesome.
people.
I know. I know. It's great, right? People you haven't seen in a while. Um, one of the first questions I like to ask, because I think it's a good way for our audience to get to know people, and I know you have so many that you can share, but what is your favorite food memory?
Oh boy, uh, yes, way too many to sort of pick one.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll pick one of the most formative, which is that I was born and raised in a very multi-ethnic neighborhood in Washington, D.C. called Mount Pleasant, which at the time was Mount Not Pleasant at all. It was the height of the crack epidemic, and this neighborhood was stood in the shadow of the burned out shells of buildings from the '68 riots in DC, and it was a neighborhood very much in continual transition. But it was Eritrean, Ethiopian, Guatemalan, Honduran, mostly El Salvadorian communities, a lot of African American Black community.
Yeah.
And what was so amazing about these communities, so many of them were fleeing civil unrest in their own countries, coming here. And as you and I think everybody on this webinar in your constituency and constellation would agree that immigration is, it's the foundation of what this country is and why it's great. And but these were people that were here maybe not because of their own. This wasn't their first choice, but they were fleeing unrest. And when you're running for your lives, you take with you your family and your traditions, and the very best of those traditions are communicated through food at the table.
Yeah.
And these were communities that didn't have really much of anything in their new world, but yet found it within them to share, and the generosity and the communion of our commons at the table. And all the little bodegas which service their needs, which introduced me to carambola and the heady Eritrean Ethiopian spices and goat meat, when I was back in the early 80s. So that idea that food was not only a physical exploration of our world, but also of a cultural exploration, and sort of expounded upon the profound power of food to self-identify, to share with the world, but also to receive. So that's been the foundation of everything I've done since.
It has. That's so eloquently put. And I lived in both Adams Morgan and Columbia Heights. And, the first Ethiopian food I ever had, before going to Ethiopia was in Mount Pleasant or Adams Morgan, one of them. And
the Red Sea?
Yeah, and it's like amazing, and I was in my 20s, and it was, those sorts of being exposed to all of that rich culture. And then, with the El Salvadorian food that is so prevalent, I hope it's still prevalent. I haven't been back to those neighborhoods in years, but they've changed quite a bit.
Yes.
I was in Petworth recently, and there's just all of these amazing, like, restaurants that I'd never seen before, but also like Soul Cycle. And it's weird how the city has become increasingly gentrified, and I feel like has pushed a lot of those folks with those rich culinary traditions further and further out of the city.
Certainly. And
Yeah.
it's a bit of a complicated legacy for me to even understand, as I was born and raised there, but I was certainly part of a gentrifying wave. My first restaurant, Cafe St. X in Bar Pilar down on 14th and T Street. My first restaurant was in the building in which Duke Ellington's parents ran their corner store.
Yeah.
There is very much a complicated legacy about that, but also to the fact that, I was born into a neighborhood in which 30% of the house stock was empty. It was a neighborhood that was in such transition and movement that it was, it's hard to know where it started and where it ended and where it was going. And, but it certainly created an incredible experience for me. DC was, anything east of the park, Rock Creek Park, for those of you who know DC, really is an incredibly interesting, diverse town. And I credit it with who I am today.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think what you had to say about the history of sort of immigration, I mean, American food is built on, the people who came here, whether they wanted to or not, as you explained before. And I think that's, something really important to remember right now as we watch the uprisings, as we watch, sort of, real change in this country taking place, and some of the inequality and inequity that has been, going on. I feel like there's more movement towards recognizing, again, those rich culinary traditions and who they came from and why they are here.
Yeah. Well, and it's one of the, I think that's why seafood is so interesting to me, because seafood is, along with vegetables, but certainly as a center of the plate protein, which is the way that we eat in America, largely, and then certainly sort of historically, it is by far the most diverse of the center of the plate proteins that we have, to the point where you can name on two hands, maybe even one, the kinds of beef there are,
right.
The kinds of pork and chicken that are really widely available. And then you look at the common species available in the United States, and there's over 2,000 species that are marketed here. And even within a category seemingly as simple as salmon, you find that there is near infinite variety and diversity there. And what I've come to understand, that diversity is the cornerstone of sustainability. Whether you're talking about society, whether you're talking about economics, don't put all of your money in one stock. Just don't do it. Society is never healthy when it's in an echo chamber of like-minded people just talking to each other. And this goes for ecologically as well. The foundation of sustainability is that diversity. And I've really learned that both through my experience living in DC, but also just living and working all over the world. And one of the interesting parallels that as you were talking there, thinking about, is that 90+% of the seafood we eat in this country is imported, meaning that our decisions that we make have an outsized impact to communities far beyond our vision and our understanding even. And that's what makes seafood so damn complicated. It's also what it makes it so damn compelling to me in terms of a pathway and a change agent, the potential that it yields.
Yeah, and we've seen real disruptions to the supply chain of seafood because of COVID-19. At least at the beginning, when planes weren't flying, folks couldn't get on trawlers. You couldn't dock anywhere. What are you seeing in terms? I mean, you live in Maine, which is a seafood sort of mecca in so many ways. But what are you seeing, in terms of your own research around the supply chain disruption, and how that's impacting communities, fishing communities all over the world? Because
seafood, it's hard to just give, any sort of broad brush stroke answers, other than maybe talking about market forms and the future of that, which I will in a second. But seafood is the most globally traded food commodity, more than double corn and soy combined. And so to just look at, to say, you know, hey, what's happening in shrimp? Wow.
Yeah.
It's one of the most complex, obtuse, obscured food supplies that there are. And you know, beginning to see, you know, entire countries' production, as we're seeing with Chilean farmed salmon, which is bearing its own issues. But then India, you know, farmed shrimp in India, where they just killed off tens of millions of tons of shrimp, simply because they're a fast-growing species. There was no market. There was no way to process them. You know, with safety, there was no freezer space anywhere to put them into, and no market that was demanding them or foreseen market demand. You know, during COVID, so you get into such a complicated world there. But what I do hope comes out of this is an increased focus and a shift towards frozen seafood. And for all of you culinarians out there who think I'm blasphemizing myself here, you know, I would urge you to take a look anew at frozen seafood. It earned, yes, rightly, a very bad reputation, because freezing seafood was what we did as the last step to stop from throwing it into the garbage. It was a means to arrest, you know, to prevent spoilage. But now, you know, and basically it was frozen on Friday night after the faithful few didn't buy it at the store for you know, fish and chips Friday. But nowadays, it's oftentimes frozen on the boat or within hours of capture on land, directly associated with the fishery geographically. And it's frozen at such low temperatures that the freezing process just physiologically doesn't impact the flavor and texture the way it once did in lesser technology. And you get into the supply chain logistics of this. Well, it helps out fisheries by evening out supply. And so you're not in these boom bust cycles of wild fisheries. It makes it safer because fishermen can go fish when it's not a hurricane out because the market demands it right now. Then you have decreased food waste, and up to 40% of all seafood is thrown out post-consumer in America.
Travesty.
It's and many big bad words to describe that. Yes,
absolutely.
But then supply chain, you end up with benefits for the environmental impacts of slower impact supply chains that yield benefits across the board, and also help to reduce the price of seafood. And it's, you know, getting into my future work, what I'm doing now, I'm trying to get more people across all demographics eating more seafood. Simply put, for environmental, economic, and mostly for health benefits. And so that key part is reducing cost and creating greater access. And frozen seafood is the key, amongst others, to enable that. And so I really do look forward to that increased focus on frozen coming out post-COVID, should we be so fortunate to emerge.
Yeah, I've been hearing that a lot too. And you and I have spoken in the past about this sort of cult of fresh when we're talking about food, and especially seafood, but also other foods. And I hope, you know, as you do, that COVID, you know, leads to more sort of regionalized processing infrastructure where things can be frozen, as you said, very quickly, whether it's fish or vegetables or, you know, other types of protein. What do you think about the sort of interest in other ways of preserving fish? I mean, you can dry fish, you can ferment fish. Do you think those will take more of a hold?
Yeah, you know, I ferment a lot of fish around my house, and my nearly 10-month pregnant wife is she's had enough of it. She's like, you know, get it out of here. Get it out. You know, she in years past she hit her head on the cod hanging from the ceiling one too many times in the mudroom. And when I told her it was mistletoe of the sea and went in for a kiss, you know.
So no fermentation.
Buy it from the experts. Yes, absolutely. It's delicious and wonderful. But yeah, careful. You got to have a little bit of property to segregate the funk too. Certainly, there's been a resurgence in the interest in canned seafood, tinned seafood, you know, for the sort of a nicer way to say it, or at least foreign way to say it, as they do in the UK. We're seeing a huge interest and boom in canned seafood sales during COVID right now, simply because of convenience. And if you're shopping every 8 days instead of 3 days, as we're seeing now in the national average, you're looking to canned seafood as a convenience item. And that's my hope for frozen seafood, that it too begins, instead of being the protein that you have to buy and cook on its time scale, you're buying it as a convenience protein when putting it in your freezer. But I don't think that is necessarily going to be a massive replacement in terms of the center of the plate. Which protein are we as Americans choosing? It will always hold its place, and I hope that other species other than just tunas, which can very sustainably, there's great products out there. But if you're looking at sockeye salmon from Bristol Bay, you're looking at pink salmon from Alaska reaches north. If you're looking at mussels, clams, oysters, mackerel, sardines, herring, anchovies, these are the species that we really should be pushing our culinary attentions towards anyway. And canned, unfortunately, like frozen, has a legacy bias against it. Yeah. But if my 3.5-year-old kid squid is proof of it, if you open it with a smile and you call them baby sharks, well, they're delicious. So does anybody want to sing with me? Baby sharks. There you go. That's my gift to you.
Now that'll be in my head for days. You mentioned diversity, but you just alluded to the fact that Americans or consumers in general only eat a few species of fish. I mean, tuna is a pretty good example of that, especially when we're talking about tinned seafood. Why are we afraid to try other kinds of fish? Why are consumers so sort of baffled by seafood?
It is more complicated. Simply put, it has more variables to it. And when you start introducing variables like different species, if I'm giving you a Rhode Island red chicken versus a bantam or whatever else, you still know how to roast a chicken. But if I give you mackerel versus flounder versus salmon, people are going to look at it and say these are completely different culinary animals, which takes training, not much, but it does take training to see beyond that initial trepidation. But I like to say that seafood is the only food that's considered guilty before proven innocent.
Right.
You walk up to the fish counter and you say, is it fresh? Okay. Is it farmed or is it wild? Does it have mercury? Does it have Fukushima radiation? I hear that farm fish is raised in a toilet, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, oh my God. By the time that I even just get you to meet me at neutral around seafood, 4 minutes ago, you walked away and got the chicken. Like the American consumer is like, So yes, it's complicated. Well, it's not complicated, but it is more complex, but also more interesting from a culinary standpoint. But from a procurement standpoint, it requires us to have greater knowledge and confidence in that knowledge. And that's been a real difficulty in conveying that knowledge to folks.
Yeah,
and
absolutely. Well, and you wrote this piece about why seafood matters, and you debunked some of the myths that I think a lot of folks have around seafood, that wild is always better, wild caught is always better. You'd already talked about toxins. People just sort of assume that there's a high level of toxins in some fish. Can you talk a little bit more about what other myths we need to debunk so that people will eat more seafood?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost is that it is more difficult to cook. I'm going to, let's see, I don't have my angles right here. There you go. I'm going to do this. I'm going to show you my secret Top Chef technique.
Awesome.
Right there. That's my toaster oven.
Yeah, I was going to say, it looks like a toaster oven.
$89. Yep. I cook seafood in that 4 nights a week. Turn it on to roast at 300 degrees, and just about every species of seafood just goes in there, olive oil, salt, no pepper, and it comes out, whether it's 15 minutes or 30 minutes later, it doesn't stink up the house, which is a common thing. But you know what? I mean, if you fry a steak in your house, your house is going to taste like the 99. You know, I mean, it's going to smell like the Golden Corral. Like, just, I mean, if you're frying up potatoes, it's going to smell like that too. So,
right.
you know, it's just sort of what smells are we used to rather than does our house smell. Low and slow cooking methods really help us to, you don't overcook it, because it takes a long time to go from raw to cooked. It also takes a long time to go from cooked to overcooked. So just communicating those simple narratives about how to cook, communicating the very simple narrative of diversity. Walk into a store, and if you're lucky enough, and if you have the good fortune to be in an economic position where you are shopping at a place with a live interaction, where seafood is sold fresh, ask the person behind the counter. First, introduce yourself by name. Create a personal sense of responsibility.
Absolutely.
I mean, we should be doing that anyway, because these are people on our front lines that serve us, and we should dignify them by acknowledging them. Just ask them, hey, what should I be going home with tonight? I mean, that should be the question. It's a simple thing called catch of the day. So start with good seafood, just simply like that. And so that's the myth of, is it complicated? Another myth that has come up recently, my wife just took as I said, she's closer to 10 months pregnant now. We're having our second child next Wednesday.
Oh, congratulations. Yay.
Beacon of hope within this chaos and shit show that is politics.
For real.
But she, in a breastfeeding class that she was taking, the teacher told her to completely avoid seafood because you don't want mercury in your breast milk. And while there is certainly truth to that as relates to a very few number of seafood species, all of which are, most of which are generally not eaten. We're talking about marlins, sharks, tilefish from a very specific area, king mackerels, not on everybody's daily menu. But the bottom line is that eating seafood is so vitally and fundamentally important to our human health, from in utero all the way through our childhood development, all the way into the years of our cognitive decline and healthy aging. It is dangerous to public health for women like the teacher of this breastfeeding class to be saying things like that. Yeah. It is detrimental to society. Yes, we should be careful and mindful of the choices, but bottom line is we should first say, I'm going to eat seafood because it is so important. My colleague, Dr. Dariush Mozaffarian, the Dean of Nutrition at Friedman Tufts School of Nutrition, says the 3 S's of public health are don't smoke, wear your seatbelt, and eat seafood. It's that important. So it's not necessarily a myth to bust so much as it is a perception to completely turn on our head and say, we owe it to ourselves, to our society, to be eating more seafood. And that's why I kind of call myself a seafood evangelist at this point, trying to get more people across all demographics to be eating seafood regularly as part of our diet. But then something I would really like to talk about is that farm versus wild. Yeah. Now, when I started off as a chef and as a sustainability champion, or sort of interested in using my platform vocally, I was very much a farmed and dangerous, flag waver. That farm seafood just was just not right. And I've come to realign my thinking on that. But also the industry of farming seafood has made such incredible leaps and bounds in terms of sustainability and our understanding of it. And even species like farmed salmon, which have long been the poster fish of everything that's wrong with the entire concept of farming seafood. We now have leading examples like Quarry Arctic up in Norway. That's first green listed net pen salmon by Monterey Bay Aquarium. You've got a whole host of yellow list. You've got a whole host of new recirc aquaculture systems, so land-based salmon farming that are automatically green listed by Monterey Bay Aquarium. And if you're going to say there's a gold standard, well, it's that or the Aquaculture Stewardship Council or best aquaculture practices. And all of those are saying this is our future. So is the UNFAO. So we need as a culture to rethink that legacy bias that was earned, much like frozen seafood earned a bad rep. We need to rethink it. And same thing with farmed seafood. And if I may sort of lengthen this response, and
of course,
a lot to that question, but the biggest impediment to understanding what farmed seafood, the role that it's going to play in our future as partner to and in collaboration with wild, which must endure, is the lack of social license. And social license defined is the credit that we give to industry when we understand the virtue and value that it brings to society. And we simply don't understand fishing in general, largely as a community, but certainly fish farming. You know, if I ask you to close your eyes and picture the small American family farmer, American Gothic, with the the undulating hills bathed in autumn splendor, setting sun with perfectly patterned rows of corn leading off into the distance with the red barn, paint fading, white house, paint chipping, picket fence. Right. Bam! This is the thread by which the fabric of America has been woven, right? I mean, we get it. We literally even sing of it in our national songs, the amber waves of rain-fruited plains. But if I ask you to picture a fishery or a farm, most people are they're standing on a dock gazing wistfully out at the wine dark sea, thinking as though a fishery or a farm is something that happens beyond the horizon of our attention and executed by someone else other. But to understand that a fish farm reflects the same values as does a land farm, as does a fishery, we begin to see ourselves in that. And when we see ourselves reflected in the communities, we understand that a fishery or a fish farm is the sum of the labors and aspirations of a community. What's more beautiful than that?
It's really beautifully put, yeah.
Especially when it's in the noble pursuit of feeding people healthy, environmentally sustainable food. And so it's that idea that the real cultural revolution with seafood that we need to engender is we see the land beautiful for our presence there. We call it agriculture because we think we're improving upon the land. But we look at the ocean and we think it beautiful for our absence there. And the idea that we need to begin to see the human future as blue and to understand the beauty and value of our presence and stewardship on and in the ocean is fundamental to our health, our economy, and to the health of our environment.
Absolutely. You
Amen.
are an evangelist. I was just like, thank you. I mean, this awareness and education and the evangelism of this, is this why you created the Coastal Culinary Academy? Is that to get that message out there?
Yeah. Yes, very much. All of that sort of high level thinking is embedded in that, but it's also, we just have to create a generation of culinarians who look to seafood as an aspirational ingredient category. Yeah. We have to create educational material that is injected into, whether it's the apprenticeship programs, where you just learn on the job and rise up as I did, or whether it's in the culinary school programs, just inject seafood content there that empowers and engages students to become champions of this ingredient category that's going to help everyone if we eat more of it.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think, that information will trickle to the people like that your wife went to in the breastfeeding class. If we have better and longer and more in-depth conversations about the benefits of seafood, then we won't be spreading those myths.
I agreed. Well, can I ask you a question? To that social license aspect of fisheries and seafood, how do you see sort of the blue and the green economies merging? I mean, you are so rooted in the conversation and the progenitor of so much of this conversation. How does it relate to your work?
I mean, I think for me, it's, my expertise, if I can call it that, has always been on land-based agriculture, right? And, I have admit freely that I know very little except for, reading all of your great books and materials, little about seafood and fisheries. I have visited fisheries all over the world, places like Ghana, or where they're processing fish, and tried to educate myself. But I think what's surprising to me is that there's still that divide, despite a lot of work by people like you, by Niaz Dory, by people who try to sort of connect fishers to farmers and that kind of thing. And so I think one of Food Tank's goals, by talking to you and so many other seafood experts over the last several weeks since COVID began, has been to for us to create those connections or help develop them and amplify them, because you're doing it so well. Niaz is doing it so well. So many great organizations are, but I'm not doing it enough. And so that's part of why we're talking to you, because I think more environmental organizations need to be taking this on, more food and agriculture nonprofits, like the very small one that we have with our voice. We need to be taking this on and having conversations like this, so that those connections are more, that there is greater awareness about them, because there hasn't been, and that my own ignorance has prevented Food Tank from writing about it more.
Oh. Well, I think that you said your expertise, if you could call yourself that. Yes, I think you can. Guys, you're at the top of the heap there. And I'm glad you mentioned Niaz. She is certainly a luminary and a leader in this field. And though she and I have sort of different visions of aspects of the future of the sustained blue economies, her work, holy shit, and wow, is she amazing. And you want to talk about somebody who wears their passion on their sleeve, and she is truly something. I respect and admire her greatly, and I know that she has really done incredible work of integrating these conversations. And so anybody that's listening who's not familiar with Niaz Dory and Northwest Atlantic Maritime Association, NAMA, amongst others, please check them out. But yeah. So what's next for you, Dan? What conversation's up next?
What conversation is up next is with Liberty's Kitchen in New Orleans. I used to live in New Orleans, so that's our next one today. But yeah, we're just chugging along. It's been a really interesting week. We had some good news yesterday with a grant from the Julia Child Foundation. I was named a Julia Child Foundation award recipient, so that was kind of fun. So yeah, we're having, despite all of the craziness that is going on in the world right now, I think this is the time to be involved in the food system, and so honored that I get to chat with folks like you. It's given me a time to reflect and really get to know people better, even though I can't be with them in person. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's been such a pleasure. You're the most energetic person I know. I wish you and your wife and your son the best next week when your new family member comes.
Thank you. Well, it's all the seafood that I eat that keeps me young at heart, and passionate we have and share for the work we do. So thanks for all your leadership, Danny. Thank you for inviting me to your platform and into your community. You're a legend and a leader, and appreciated. So thank you.
You're so nice. Thanks so much, Barton. I'll see you soon, I hope.
Cheers.
Bye. Stay well.